In 1980, Zimbabwe emerged from a brutal war of liberation full of hope and promise. But just 2 decades later, the country would be brought to its knees, its economy in free fall, its currency worthless, and its international standing shattered. At the heart of this collapse lay the question of land. Was Zimbabwe's land reform an overdue act of justice correcting centuries of colonial dispossession, or did it trigger one of the greatest peacetime economic collapses in modern African history? This is the story of how land and the legacy of empire came to define Zimbabwe's post-independence fate. To understand Zimbabwe's land crisis, we must go back nearly a century. In 1930, the Land Apportionment Act legally divided land along racial lines. White settlers, who made up less than 5% of the population, were allocated the most fertile, high rainfall areas, while the black Africans were confined to semi-arid native reserves. This was not just racist policy, it was a blueprint for economic domination. By the late 1970s, white farmers controlled around 45% of all the land, including most of the best agricultural territory. This land was acquired through conquest, displacement, and state-sanctioned theft, especially during the 1890s when the British South Africa Company under Cecil Rhodes appropriated vast areas for white settlement. Zimbabwe's liberation war from 1964 to 1979 was fought over 2 main grievances, namely political disenfranchisement and land dispossession. In 1979, as the war reached a bloody climax, Britain brokered a peace deal at Lancaster House in London. The result was Zimbabwe's independence, but with strings attached. The new constitution froze land reform for 10 years. Land could only be acquired on a willing buyer, willing seller basis, and Britain agreed to help fund this. Between 1980 and 1997, London contributed £44 million towards land resettlement under the Land Resettlement Programme Phase 1. However, this process moved slowly and inefficiently. A 1998 audit found that many redistributed farms ended up in the hands of political elites, civil servants, and military officers, and not necessarily the landless peasants. Despite promises, only about 3 million hectares out of 11 million targeted had been redistributed by the late 1990s. Rural poverty remained widespread, and frustration began to simmer. By the late 1990s, the post-independence euphoria had faded. Zimbabwe's economy was stagnating, corruption was rampant, and social unrest was growing. In 1997, the war veterans, a powerful but increasingly marginalized group, demanded compensation. Under pressure, Robert Mugabe authorized unbudgeted payouts of $50,000 Zimbabwean dollars per veteran, plus monthly pensions. The move wiped 35% off the Zimbabwean dollar's value in a single day, which is known locally as Black Friday. But this only served to embolden the war vets. Led by figures like Chenjerai Hunzwi, they now demanded land, the very promise that had fueled the liberation struggle. The breaking point came in 2000, when Mugabe's government called a referendum to amend the constitution to allow compulsory land acquisition without compensation. It was defeated, with 55% voting against it, the first major loss for ZANU-PF since independence. Stung by defeat, Mugabe turned to the war veterans, and just weeks later, the fast-track land reform program began, not through legislation, but through force. Thousands of white-owned farms were occupied, often violently. Mugabe claimed these occupations were spontaneous, but internal documents and eyewitness accounts suggested that they were orchestrated by the state to punish dissent and to regain political support. The white commercial farming class, numbering just a little under 5,000, was driven out. Many of them fled to South Africa, Zambia, and the UK. About 300,000 farm workers, mostly black Zimbabweans, also lost their livelihoods. Interestingly, or rather unfortunately, the fate of these black farm workers is often overlooked in Zimbabwe's land reform debate. The global reaction to the land grabs was immediate. Britain, now led by Tony Blair, refused further funding for land reform without transparency and due process. In 2002, the European Union imposed targeted sanctions, travel bans, and asset freezes on Mugabe and senior ZANU-PF officials. The United States also passed the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act in 2001, which blocked Zimbabwe from accessing credit from international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Robert Mugabe hit back, accusing the West of neo-colonial sabotage. He famously said,
"We are not Europeans. We have not asked for any inch of Europe or any square inch of that territory. So, Blair, keep your England and let me keep my Zimbabwe."
But the effects of these sanctions were severe. The loss of foreign aid and international credit lines plunged the country into isolation. The IMF had already suspended Zimbabwe in 1999 over arrears and fiscal mismanagement. Without new loans or investment, the economy began to implode. Although Western media framed Zimbabwe's land reform as purely a power grab and ignoring legitimate historical grievances, Robert Mugabe's heavy-handed methods and disregard for the rule of law also made that narrative hard to refute. Between 2000 and 2008, Zimbabwe's economy shrank by over 50%, one of the worst contractions in peacetime history. Agricultural output, one of the country's lifelines, also collapsed. Maize production fell by 70% between the year 2000 and 2004. Tobacco, the top export crop, dropped from 237 million kg in 2000 to just 55 million kg by 2008. The government responded by printing more money, which only led to hyperinflation. By 2008, monthly inflation reached 79.6 billion% according to the IMF. A loaf of bread cost 35 million Zimbabwean dollars. The Zim dollar was eventually abandoned in 2009. Social services collapsed, hospitals lacked medicine, and schools couldn't pay teachers. Life expectancy dropped to 37 years for men, which was among the lowest globally. The middle class was also wiped out, and an estimated 3 to 4 million Zimbabweans fled the country, creating a major diaspora across South Africa, the UK, and beyond. 2 decades later, and the legacy is still unfolding, although not all is lost. Since the early 2010s, Zimbabwe has recovered some agricultural output, especially in tobacco, driven by contract farming schemes supported by Chinese companies. By 2021, tobacco production had risen above 200 million kg, almost matching pre-land reform numbers. But maize and wheat, which are essential for food security, remain volatile. Many resettled farmers lack access to irrigation, credit, or mechanization. Most of them don't hold title deeds, which means they can't even use the land as collateral. The government has taken cautious steps towards reform. In 2020, it agreed to pay $3.5 billion in compensation to white farmers, although the money is yet to be raised. This is not for the land itself, but for infrastructure and improvements in line with international law. Meanwhile, land audits reveal that some elites hold multiple farms, violating redistribution limits. Land in Zimbabwe remains highly politicized. Land reform was never just about economics. It was about memory, identity, and sovereignty. Zimbabwe's tragedy is not that it pursued land justice. It is that justice was used as a shield for political survival and delivered through chaos instead of policy. Today, Zimbabwe still bears the scars of its land reform, but it also holds a lesson for Africa and the rest of the world. Justice pursued without structure can unravel a nation, and even noble causes must be built on solid foundations.